Hey there! In this video, I'll be comparing the dynamic range of the Canon R6 Mark II with the Canon R5. I've been using the R6 Mark II as much as possible since it came out. I've been really enjoying it and putting it up against a lot of the other cameras, but a lot of you have been asking about how it stacks up against the original R5, so I was able to borrow one from one of my buddies, so big shout out to Brandon. He has two awesome channels, which I'll leave linked down below. You should definitely check out. He's an amazing filmmaker and YouTuber. He's also a good buddy of mine, so he let me borrow this for a short amount of time. I'm gonna try to test it against the R6 Mark II as much as possible, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. If you're a regular watcher, or sorry, viewer of the channel, haven't posted in a few weeks. You're probably wondering where I've been. So at the end of the video, I'll talk a little bit about that and also a little bit of a channel update. But if you're here for the dynamic range stuff, let's talk about that first. I don't wanna waste your time. Okay, so let's talk about the dynamic range of these two cameras. So like usual, when I do test the dynamic range of cameras, I like to do what's called a latitude test or a push-pull test. So you purposely overexpose and underexpose the image to take a look and see how well these cameras do in the highlights and the shadows. It's a great thing to do in addition to getting the formal number of dynamic range stops, because you really get a sense of how these cameras actually look in terms of noise, detail, and color when you push the image to its extremes. And I'll also give an example to show these cameras against each other in a high dynamic range situation. So like usual, let me explain how I do my tests. And so on these two cameras, the codecs I chose on the R6 Mark II in the 4K IPB, which is a 6K oversample, so that's the highest possible quality mode that this camera can shoot. I will test the 6K RAW in this camera when it becomes available on the Atomos Ninja firmware, which they haven't updated yet, so I can't do that, but it will come out. When that comes out, I will test it. Now on the R5, I chose to shoot in the 4K HQ All-I, which is a 8K oversample. I decided to not shoot in 8K because most people shoot in 4K HQ in this camera, and I think it was a little more comparable. But that's a big difference as it shoots in All-I versus IPB, which I don't think makes a difference in this situation, but just letting you know exactly what I did. Of course, I shot both cameras in C-Log 3 at their base ISOs of 800. I exposed for 35% on a gray card, which is how you're supposed to expose C-Log 3 by the book. And then basically, I just adjust the shutter speed to over or underexpose the image. And I do a custom white balance for both cameras. And then when I bring it to the computer, I don't use any LUTs, but I just adjust the exposure, the contrast, and the saturation. I don't adjust the color whatsoever, so you'll also get a chance to see the differences in colors between these two cameras. First off, let's take a look at the overexposure test. And the results from this are pretty consistent with all the other Canon cameras that I've tested in C-Log 3. They're good up to about 4 stops over, and then the image breaks at 5 stops over. So in general, I'd say C-Log 3 does really well in the highlights. There's a lot of information there, and it's, as I said, very consistent with the other cameras I've tested. Now on to the underexposure test. And again, this is pretty consistent with the other Canon cameras I've tested. They're both good until about 2 or 2 1/3 stops under, but below that, I'd definitely say the R5 is better in the shadows in terms of having a cleaner image. There is a color shift on both cameras. The R6 Mark II tends to shift more magenta and the R5 shifts more green. I also noticed that the R5 autofocus struggles when it's underexposed, whereas the R6 Mark II definitely stayed locked on more. I was using the Face Eye Detect on both cameras during this, and the R5 definitely struggled more, but it definitely did better in terms of the shadows in getting a little bit more dynamic range in those lower stops. Now let's take a look at an example of a high dynamic range situation. So what I like to do is stand in a dark room next to a bright window, and I expose for the highlights, make sure I don't clip the highlights, and then try to see how much information I can see in the shadows and what it looks like. So comparing here the R6 Mark II with the R5, you definitely see that the R5 looks better here. It's definitely cleaner in the shadows and just a lot more accurate, but you do still see that color shift of the magenta and the green. But overall, I would definitely say the R5 has a little bit of an edge here in terms of the dynamic range in the shadows. All right, so what are my takeaways? First of all, the R5 has slightly more dynamic range than the R6 Mark II, as you saw in the testing and also in the example. Now, this is really interesting to me because I know there's a lot of limitations on these cameras based on having only C-Log 3 and Canon not putting C-Log 2 in these cameras. And I've talked about this extensively in other videos, but basically C-Log 2 has more dynamic range than C-Log 3, and these cameras don't have C-Log 2. As I said earlier on, I will test the dynamic range of the 6K RAW when I'm able to, when Atomos releases new firmware for their Ninja V and V+, and I'm really curious to see if this 6K RAW will have more dynamic range than the internal compressed codecs. After this test, it is very interesting to me. Anyways, so as I said earlier on in this video and also in other videos, C-Log 3 does very well in the highlights, not so great in the shadow. So if you are shooting in a run and gun situation, I recommend that you expose as high as you possibly can without clipping the highlights, and then that will eliminate some of the noise in the shadows. If you're curious about how to expose and color grade C-Log 3, I made a very detailed video about that, which I'll leave a link down below. You should definitely check that out. If you are shooting in a controlled lighting situation like this here with not a lot of dynamic range, I say maybe you want to experiment with overexposing the R6 Mark II, and I usually don't recommend that in controlled lighting situations. I usually recommend that you use the camera manufacturer's recommendations for, IRE percentage on a gray card for wherever the subject is, and that's how I expose everything I do in the studio here and for all of my tests. And there are some trade-offs for overexposing cameras, and basically you're trading dynamic range and the highlights and the shadows. You don't get anything for free. I am doing some testing on this too, and hopefully I will make a detailed video about how to get the best possible image and get good exposure with the R6 Mark II, because I think it's a little bit different than some of the other Canon cameras. There will be more detailed testing coming up with these two cameras, and I will make a full comparison video because a lot of people have been asking me, as I said, to compare the R5 with the R6 Mark II. And the prices are pretty similar because the R5 used is going for, I'd see between $3,000, $3,300 in the US versus $2,500 new for the R6 Mark II. Now on to the channel update. First of all, I just want to have a huge thank you to all of you for supporting me and the channel in 2022. It was an awesome year. We saw a lot of growth, built community, and just had a lot of fun nerding out on cameras. I am really, really excited about 2023. If you're a regular viewer, you're probably wondering where I've been the last few weeks. Well, I went on vacation. I took a break, which was awesome, and I haven't done that in a very long time. My wife and kids and I went on a family trip to Mexico, had a great time on vacation. Mostly ate a lot, sat around and drank margaritas, but we did get out a little bit and got out to do some birding. We got a guide to come out with us, and I got a lot of really cool footage from that, which I can't wait to share with you and incorporate into some content about the R6 Mark II and the RF 100-500, which I've been loving that combination. Now, there are some limitations with the R6 Mark II as I've been going through and testing and comparing with other cameras, but I really do like it for wildlife and some other stuff. So what's coming up in 2023? Well, first of all, I'm going to be doing some client work, which is going to take up a good amount of my time, which is a lot of fun for me and also is good income for my family. So I'm going to do my best to make as many videos as possible, but we might see a reduced output in terms of videos as I'm busier with other stuff, and I do have a lot of family obligations as well. You will start to see some sponsored content on this channel, which, as I've said before, I've been very careful about who I want to work with. I just want to continue to be neutral and as objective as possible in terms of brands and my analysis and my opinions, so that you're not getting sponsored content that would influence my decision in terms of giving my honest opinion about all the gear that I'm testing. Now, if you want to help support the channel, like I usually say, please hit subscribe. There are also affiliate links down below for all the gear that I use, and they really do help me out quite a bit. Share these videos with your friends. You know the drill. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.